So, the story of Ruth, one of our amazing stories in the Bible that speaks of God's love through tragedy and the way he redeems us. The story about poor people who end up on their own with no prospects, but God redeems them as they seek to come back into his family and live where they shouldn't have gone for in the first place. It's a story really of showing that even when we make bad decisions, we can recover from it. It doesn't stop our suffering, and it doesn't stop the consequences of making bad decisions. As the book says, it takes place during the period of the Judges. So Israel have been in the land a few hundred years. Moses has died. Joshua, who's led them for a significant number of years, people of Israel, has died. And all the elders that ran the country under Joshua have died as too. And Israel has started to drift away from worshipping the God who promised to be with them, the covenant God of Israel. People, despite the warnings, had started to worship other gods, got involved with the other tribes and nations around them. And as a consequence of that, God brings famine on the land. Let's read what the scriptures say about this. First reference is from the book of Judges. Joshua, son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110. And after that whole generation had been gathered to their ancestors, another generation grew up, who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. Then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals, that's other gods. They forsook the Lord and God, the God of their ancestors, who had brought them out of Egypt. They followed and worshipped various gods of the people around them. So the land starts to suffer. The problem was that, of course, Israel was a bit of a patriarchal society, ruled by men. And in a way, when disaster came to families, there was little protection for a woman to bring up a family in Israel without a man in her life. Thus, lots of people became vulnerable. Abimelech, the husband of Naomi, decided, because there was famine in Israel, to take a detour and go to Moab. Moab, they lived in Bethlehem, where we can see here, and there was famine in the land east of the Jordan River. And so Abimelech decides to take his family, his wife and his two late teenage sons, into the land of Moab. Now Moab was a land that Israel had had trouble with for many years and would go on having trouble well into the reign of Solomon. So in many ways, Abimelech led his family away from the Lord, and that caused problems. Abimelech died. His two sons married local girls, Ophri and Ruth, and settled down into family life. And Naomi was safe in that family unit because the men could earn a living and support their wives. But out of that, the two sons die, and Naomi and her daughter-in-law are left alone, with no means of sustaining them monetarily. Naomi comes a bit bitter, but she hears that Israel has recovered from the famine. It's been about 10 years, and so decides to go back. She also decides that perhaps it wouldn't be a place to take her two Moab daughter-in-laws back into Israel. Firstly, because in a sense that would show up to the community where she was going back to her sin. Because not only would it have been a sin to leave Israel, it would have been a sin in Jewish eyes for the sons to marry Moabites, specifically prevented to in Scripture. So that's why she didn't want the two girls to come back with her. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judea, together with his wife and two sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech. His wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his two sons were Mahol and Kilon. They were Ephrodites from Bethlehem, Judea, and they went to Moab to live there. So here is a family of God's people who made a bad decision, decided to move out of the protection of Israel into an unprotected area of Moab, an enemy of Israel. And the law should have prevented Elimelech from moving to Moab. Now we don't know, but it was a requirement that Moses left, that the law, that's the first 5 books of the Bible, should be read regularly to all people of Israel. So there should have been no reason that Elimelech didn't know that it would have been unwise to move to Moab. I mean, Bethlehem, if it was a great place to live, then certainly Moab was certainly the opposite. Moabites were the descendants of Lot's incestuous relationship with one of his daughters. And the Moabites were a tribe of people by the time that Joshua arrived on the banks of the Jordan that tried to infiltrate the whole nation of Israel as it camped awaiting to cross the Jordan. The Bible tells us the Moabite women tried to seduce the Israelite men. So they didn't have a good history. And then so we read that Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her two sons. They married Moabite women, one named Ophrah and the other named Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahol and Kilon died, and Naomi was left without her two sons in a very vulnerable position. These 3 women had lost all their security, and yet, despite the sinful nature of their excursion into Moab, God still loved them. And that is the point we need to remind ourselves very much for today, really, I think. That, we need to follow the ways of God. and it's not good for us to move outside the protected ways that God wants us to live and to go off track. Because I believe there is a sense of protection when we live within a Christian community. There used to be an old advert, I remember, back in the days of black and white television, that showed, it was an advert for insurance. I think it was for Norwich Union, although I can't remember, but it showed a family and it talked about the protection of insurance around a family, and as they spoke about it, a castle wall appeared behind round the family, and somebody knocked over and said, you know, get the protection of insurance behind you. I think that's almost an analogy of the protection we have within the Christian community, the Christian church. Because whilst we are part of a Christian community, there is a sense of protection because of the prayer that goes on. We're all looking after each other, we're praying for each other. There is a Christian protection about it. But if we move outside that, we quite often lose that protection. And I can recount 2 or 3 families who I've known over the years who've moved outside the protection of the church because of disagreements, rows and all sorts of things, and have moved out and believed they could carry on living outside the Christian community that they'd grown up in, and disaster has overtaken them. Now, I'm not saying that's automatically going to happen, but I do believe there is a sense of community that we gain, and security we gain when we meet and worship together. And when you go off track, off the road, then disaster can take, and we need to remember that. So when God's people don't always make good decisions, when trouble comes to our lives, we can do one of 3 things, can't we? We can endure the trouble, we can choose to escape it and bury it and believe that it's not happened to avoid everything, the consequences of it, or we can challenge it, we can enlist it, engage with it, to engage through it with God and seek to overcome it. And this is what happens with the story of Ruth, in which we see Ruth decides not to engage the trouble in Moab. She doesn't want to, she wants to go back home, and therefore she's not looking to escape where she should be, had have been. She goes back to engage the problem by going back to Bethlehem. Abimelech made a wrong decision when he decided to move. He walked, we could say, by sight rather by faith. He probably knew he should have remained, but because of the famine, he decides to solve the problem himself and not to remain with God's people for them to solve the problems they were in together. And it was nothing new. If we look back into the early chapters of Genesis, we see very much that Abraham, when famine hit the land, fled to Egypt. There's no sense in the text of Genesis that Abraham asked God whether it was right for him to move to Egypt where there was food. He just did it. And because of the lack of there, he obviously moved without the consent of God, walking off track. And it takes ages for God to redeem that problem back. So it's something we must need to remember. But not all hope is lost, because we know that God is at work and causes U-turns in the lives of people he loves, if we're open to having our lives U-turned. News filtered back to Naomi that the famine was over. and she decided to go back after 10 years. But it was a bit of a problem with her daughter-in-law. She was a bit worried that they would not be welcomed back into her hometown because they were Moabites. And of course, the Israeli people have been told not to marry. So that's why at first she decided not to invite them back, but to encourage them to go home to their own homes, and perhaps they could remarry that way. So let's read the story now. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her two daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to Judah. Then Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness as you have shown kindness to your dead and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept aloud and said to her, "We will go back to your people." But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband, even if I thought there was still hope for me. Even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters, it is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me." Naomi even felt bitter about the situation she had found herself in. She had been bitter about the circumstances of her husband and sons dying, no doubt, and quite reasonably so too. And that's why she wasn't keen on the daughters coming back. Perhaps that was a way she could perhaps forget the past, forget the disaster that had happened. So that was her plan, but God had other ideas, because God had been at work in Ruth's heart and she had become a believer. As they wept aloud again, then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. "Look," said Naomi, "your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her." But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." When Naomi realised that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. So the two women went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them, and the women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" "Don't call me Naomi," she told them. "Call me Mara, because the Lord had made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the harvest was beginning. The one thing that stands out in this story is, how did Ruth suddenly become a believer? She grew up in a nation that didn't worship the God of Israel, but Ruth grew under the family of Naomi and Abimelech, who did worship God. One can only conclude that Naomi's witness to the girls showed that she was a believer. Perhaps in that house they had a prayer time. It wouldn't be unusual for a Jewish family to pray together. It wouldn't be unusual for the head of the household, Elimelech, to pray for his family at meal times. And I suspect that that probably carried on after he died. Perhaps one of the boys growing up, the husbands of Ruth or Ophrah, prayed. I don't know. Perhaps they had their own worship. There wouldn't have been any synagogues in Moab at all. But it's certainly, I believe, reading between the lines of this story, that Naomi, before her two sons died, was a very ardent worshipper of God. Her faith shone out. And she probably could even have started teaching her daughter-in-laws about the Jewish faith, about the God of Israel. It certainly made a difference that Ruth no longer wanted to go back, or many commentators suggest that Ruth no longer believed in the gods that the Moabites worshipped. She had come to realise that they were only blocks of wood or blocks of stone, and she had already begun to worship the God of Israel. And that gave her the strength to come out with some amazing words. "Don't urge me to leave you or turn back from you," she said to Naomi. "Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, even if death separates you and me." That's an incredible statement from somebody who grew up worshipping idols in Moab. Ruth had obviously become a believer, and therefore God was beginning to talk to her and work through her, and she saw her place beside her mother-in-law, supporting her. She probably didn't know how at that time, but she had grown to trust in God sufficiently to come back into a town that may not accept her at all. But she believed that would happen. She was walking by faith, whereas the family, when they left Bethlehem 10 years before, walked by sight. And that's something for us to remember. And I think it's something for us to be encouraged about in our relationships. I certainly believe that our lifestyles will make and can make a difference to those around us. As this striking story really tells us. Doesn't matter who we are, we don't have to be famous, we just ordinary people. If we're faithful to our God, we're faithful worshipping Jesus, then God will be faithful to those around us, and people will see in us Jesus. I think it's something we should pray about. We often are not brave enough to stand up on street corners and preach the gospel to people we've got no idea who we are. But it's something I think we should be aware of, that it's our life of witness that can make a big difference in this world today. Don't give up hope. If family members don't believe that your faithful witness will make a difference. Because the story of Ruth tells us, amongst other things, that God works in the lives of the people he loves. And that includes people who don't understand the importance of their relationships with the living God. That's our hope that the gospel brings, and which is very poignant in the book of Ruth. So next week we look at how Ruth meets Boaz and the real love story begins.